In the frosty morning air of Norfolk, something extraordinary was happening. While the world watched for grand royal gestures, King Charles III was writing a different kind of history, one prayer at a time, one farming conversation at a time. This is the story of how a monarch and his queen chose authenticity over spectacle, and why it matters more than anyone imagined. The ancient bells of St. Mary Magdalene Church in Sandringham rang out across the Norfolk countryside on that crisp Sunday morning in late January 2025. Inside the weathered stone walls, where generations of royals had worshipped before him, King Charles III sat quietly in a wooden pew, his head bowed in prayer. There were no cameras here, no ceremonial fanfare, just a man seeking solace in faith while his wife, Queen Camilla, was miles away fighting a battle that would define their reign. Charles had always found peace in Norfolk. The rolling fields and quiet villages offered something Buckingham Palace never could: anonymity wrapped in tradition. As he listened to the familiar hymns echoing off the medieval walls, his mind wandered to the conversations he'd had just days before with local farmers whose livelihoods hung in the balance. Their weathered faces told stories of generations working the same soil, now threatened by policies that treated farming like any other business rather than the backbone of rural Britain. The king's morning routine had become almost sacred in its simplicity. He would rise before dawn, walk the grounds of Sandringham House, and spend time in quiet reflection before joining the local congregation for Sunday service. It was during these walks that he often encountered the people whose lives would be forever changed by decisions made in distant government offices. Yesterday, it had been Thomas Hartwell, a third-generation dairy farmer whose family had been supplying milk to the local community since 1962. "Your Majesty," Thomas had said, his voice carrying the weight of uncertainty, "we've been doing this for 60 years. My grandfather started with 12 cows and a dream. Now we have 120, and we're being told we're part of the problem." The inheritance tax changes proposed for agricultural land had created ripples of anxiety throughout Norfolk's farming community. Families who had worked the same fields for centuries suddenly faced the possibility of selling their heritage to pay taxes on land that had been passed down through generations. Charles had listened intently, his years of environmental advocacy giving him a unique perspective on the delicate balance between progress and tradition. He understood the government's need for revenue, but he also grasped something perhaps more important: the cultural and environmental value of keeping family farms in family hands. These weren't just businesses, they were guardians of the landscape, stewards of biodiversity, and keepers of rural traditions that couldn't be replaced once lost. The conversation with Thomas had reminded the king of his own journey toward understanding agriculture's true value. Decades ago, when he first began experimenting with organic farming on his Highgrove estate, he had been dismissed as an eccentric prince playing in the dirt. Now, those same practices were recognized as essential for environmental sustainability. But it had taken courage to persist when others doubted, and he saw that same courage in farmers like Thomas who were fighting for their way of life. As the church service continued, Charles reflected on the strange parallel between his role as monarch and the role of family farmers. Both were custodians of something larger than themselves: tradition, continuity, and service to the community. Both faced constant pressure to modernize, to become more efficient, to justify their existence in purely economic terms. Yet both served purposes that couldn't be measured solely in pounds and pence. The hymn "Jerusalem" filled the small church, its words about England's green and pleasant land taking on deeper meaning in this rural setting. Charles had sung these words countless times, but today they felt like a prayer for the very landscape that surrounded them. The green fields visible through the church's stained glass windows represented not just natural beauty, but the livelihoods of families who had shaped this land for generations. After the service, Charles made his usual rounds, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries with the local congregation. But today, the conversations turned repeatedly to the same theme: the future of farming in Britain. Margaret Ellis, whose family had grown vegetables in Norfolk for 4 generations, approached him with tears in her eyes. "My grandson was going to take over the farm," she said quietly. "He's studied agriculture at university, has all these wonderful ideas about sustainable growing. But now we don't know if we can afford to keep it in the family. The tax bill alone would force us to sell half our land." Her words echoed the concerns Charles had been hearing throughout the region. Young people eager to continue family traditions were being priced out of their own heritage. The king found himself in a delicate position.
As a constitutional monarch, he couldn't directly intervene in government policy.
But, as a landowner, environmental advocate, and someone who genuinely cared about rural communities, he felt a deep responsibility to understand and, somehow, address these concerns. His solution was characteristically thoughtful. He would learn, listen, and find ways to support farming families without overstepping his constitutional boundaries. Meanwhile, in London, Queen Camilla was pursuing her own mission with equal determination but different methods. While Charles found his calling in quiet conversations and morning prayers, Camilla had chosen a more public approach to supporting the same cause. Her schedule that week had been packed with visits to agricultural colleges, meetings with farming organizations, and discussions with rural business leaders. The Queen's approach complemented her husband's perfectly. Where Charles brought deep knowledge and personal conviction, Camilla brought practical advocacy and public visibility. She understood that the farming crisis needed both spiritual reflection and political action, both quiet diplomacy and public awareness. Her background as someone who had grown up around horses and country life gave her credibility with rural communities that appreciated authenticity over royal protocol. At Sparsholt College, where she had visited just 3 days before Charles's Norfolk service, Camilla had spoken with young agricultural students about their dreams and fears. "This isn't just about farming," she had told them. "This is about keeping rural Britain alive, about ensuring that young people have opportunities in the countryside, about maintaining the connection between the land and the people who care for it." One student, Sarah Mitchell from Cornwall, had shared her family's story with the Queen. "My dad's farm has been in our family since 1847, Sarah had explained. "I want to modernize it, introduce new technology, maybe start a farm-to-table restaurant using our own produce. But, if we can't pass it on without selling half of it to pay taxes, all those dreams disappear." Camilla had listened intently, asking detailed questions about Sarah's business plans and the challenges facing young farmers. These conversations were shaping both the King and Queen's understanding of their role in modern Britain. They were learning that their influence lay not in grand gestures or political statements, but in their ability to bridge different worlds, connecting rural communities with urban policymakers, translating the concerns of ordinary families into language that politicians and civil servants could understand. Back in Norfolk, as Charles walked home from church, he encountered more evidence of the farming community's resilience and innovation. The Weatherby family had converted part of their dairy operation into a farm shop and cafe, creating jobs for local young people while adding value to their agricultural production. Their success story showed that family farms could evolve and thrive, given the right support and policies. "The key is balance," explained Robert Weatherby, who had taken over from his father 5 years earlier. "We respect tradition but embrace innovation. We produce food, but we also provide education about where food comes from. We employ local people and support the local economy. That's worth preserving, isn't it?" Charles agreed wholeheartedly, seeing in Robert's approach a model for sustainable rural development. The King's Norfolk walks had become legendary among local residents, not for their royal grandeur but for their genuine ordinariness. Charles would stop to examine hedgerows, discuss crop rotation with farmers, and inquire about the health of livestock with the same attention he might give to state papers. This wasn't performance or public relations, it was a monarch trying to understand the land and people he served. As Sunday afternoon settled over Sandringham, Charles retreated to his study to reflect on the day's conversations and prepare for the week ahead. His desk was covered with reports on agricultural policy, letters from farming families, and proposals for initiatives that might help bridge the gap between tradition and progress. Each document represented real people facing real challenges, and he felt the weight of responsibility to help find solutions. The King's faith had always been deeply personal, but his Norfolk experiences were teaching him that spirituality and practical action were inseparable. His morning prayers in the small church had been as much about seeking guidance for his role as monarch as about personal spiritual growth. How could he serve both the constitutional requirements of his position and the genuine needs of his subjects? The answer was becoming clearer with each conversation, each walk through the Norfolk countryside, each Sunday service in the village church. Leadership, he was learning, wasn't about having all the answers, it was about asking the right questions, listening with genuine attention, and finding ways to bring people together around shared values. As the sun set over the Norfolk fields, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, Charles made a decision that would shape the coming weeks. He would continue his quiet diplomacy, his morning walks, his Sunday services. But he would also find ways to amplify the voices he was hearing, to ensure that the concerns of farming families reached the ears of those who could make a difference. The revolution brewing in the British countryside wasn't led by protesters or politicians, it was being quietly orchestrated by a king who prayed in village churches and a queen who listened to students' dreams. Together, they were discovering that true leadership in the 21st century required not just constitutional authority, but authentic human connection. The bells of St. Mary Magdalene continued to ring across Norfolk that evening, their ancient sound carrying new hopes into the gathering darkness. In London, government offices were quiet. In Norfolk, a king was preparing for another week of walks, conversations, and quiet determination to make a difference in the lives of the people he served. The story of King Charles's worship in Norfolk and Queen Camilla's support for family farming was just beginning, but already it was changing how both the royal family and the British people understood the monarchy's role in modern society. It was a story of faith meeting action, tradition embracing innovation, and quiet leadership creating profound change. The following Monday morning brought unexpected news that would test everything King Charles and Queen Camilla had been working toward. As Charles finished his morning walk through the frost-covered grounds of Sandringham, his private secretary approached with an urgent message. The Treasury had accelerated the timeline for implementing the new agricultural inheritance tax policies, and farming communities across Britain were planning coordinated protests. In London, Queen Camilla received the same news while preparing for a visit to the Royal Agricultural University. Her immediate response was characteristic. Instead of cancelling her plans, she decided to expand them. If farmers are going to make their voices heard, she told her staff, then I need to make sure I understand exactly what they're saying. The Queen's visit to the Agricultural University that morning revealed the depth of anxiety among young people pursuing careers in farming. Professor James Hartley, who had been teaching agricultural science for 20 years, painted a stark picture. "We're seeing enrollment decline for the first time in decades," he explained as they walked through the university's experimental farms. "Young people are brilliant, passionate about sustainable agriculture, full of innovative ideas. But they're choosing other careers because they can't see a future in farming." Camilla stopped to speak with a group of students who were working on a project to reduce carbon emissions in dairy farming. Their enthusiasm was infectious as they explained how new technologies could help family farms become more environmentally friendly while remaining profitable. "This is exactly the kind of innovation Britain needs," she told them. "You're not just farmers, you're environmental scientists, business innovators, and guardians of rural traditions all at once." One student, David Chen, whose family had emigrated from Hong Kong and established a market garden in Hertfordshire, shared his particular concerns. "My parents worked incredibly hard to build something from nothing," he said. "They didn't just create a business, they created jobs for local people, they supplied fresh vegetables to the community, they became part of the British story. Now we're being told that when they retire, we might have to sell the land they've invested their lives in just to pay the tax bill." The Queen listened intently, taking notes in her characteristically thorough manner. These weren't just statistics or policy abstractions, these were young people whose dreams were being threatened by decisions made in government offices far from the fields they hoped to tend. Meanwhile, in Norfolk, Charles was dealing with his own revelation. During his Tuesday morning walk, he encountered a convoy of tractors heading toward London. The farmers had decided to make their protest visible, and the sight of these massive machines on country roads bound for the capital created a powerful symbol of rural Britain's determination to be heard. Tom Harrison, a young farmer from nearby Dersingham, had stopped his tractor when he recognized the king walking along the roadside. "Your Majesty," he called out, his voice carrying over the rumble of the diesel engine, "we're not trying to cause trouble. We just want people to understand that family farms aren't big corporations. We're small businesses that happen to feed the nation." Charles approached the tractor, genuinely curious about Tom's perspective. At 28, Tom represented exactly the kind of young farmer that Britain needed to retain. He had studied at agricultural college, introduced precision farming techniques to his family's operation, and was experimenting with renewable energy generation alongside traditional crop production. Tell me about your farm, Charles said, settling into the kind of detailed conversation that had become his trademark during these Norfolk walks.
We're third generation, Tom explained, his pride evident despite his concerns. My grandfather bought the land in 1962 with money he'd saved working in construction. He cleared fields that had been neglected during the war, built up the soil, established the infrastructure. My father added modern equipment, improved the buildings, diversified into contract farming for neighbors. I've brought in GPS-guided machinery, soil testing, variable rate fertilizer application, all to be more efficient and environmentally responsible.
The king nodded, understanding the layers of investment, financial, physical, and emotional, that Tom was describing.
And now?
Now we're being told that when Dad retires, I'll need to find hundreds of thousands of pounds to pay inheritance tax on land that generates maybe 2 or 3% return in a good year. The only way to raise that money is to sell land, which means the farm gets smaller, less viable, less able to support a family. Tom's frustration was palpable, but it was mixed with determination rather than despair. This conversation crystallized something important for Charles.
The farming inheritance tax wasn't just an economic policy, it was a cultural and environmental issue with profound implications for British society.
Family farms weren't just businesses, they were repositories of knowledge, stewards of landscape, and anchors of rural communities. As Tom's tractor rejoined the convoy heading for London, Charles made a decision that would surprise his staff. He would attend the farmers' protest, not as a supporter or opponent of specific policies, but as someone who wanted to witness and understand this moment in British agricultural history. The protest in London revealed the diversity and sophistication of modern British farming in ways that surprised even seasoned political observers. These weren't angry mobs or single-issue extremists, they were educated, articulate business people who understood complex economic and environmental challenges. Many held university degrees, ran high-tech operations, and spoke knowledgeably about global food security, climate change, and sustainable agriculture. Queen Camilla, who had cleared her schedule to observe the protest, was struck by the generational diversity. Elderly farmers who remembered post-war food shortages stood alongside young agriculturalists who spoke fluently about carbon sequestration and biodiversity. Women who had built farm shops and agritourism businesses shared concerns with men who had invested heavily in precision farming equipment. One participant who caught the Queen's attention was Helen Morrison, a fourth-generation farmer from Yorkshire who had transformed her family's traditional livestock operation into a model of sustainable agriculture. Helen's farm now produced not just beef and lamb, but also renewable energy through solar panels and wind turbines, educational experiences for urban schoolchildren, and high-value processed foods sold directly to consumers. This isn't about avoiding taxes, Helen explained when Camilla approached her during the protest. This is about keeping land in the hands of people who understand its long-term value, not just its short-term profit potential. When family farms are broken up and sold to investors, we lose something that can't be replaced: the knowledge, the care, the connection between land and community that takes generations to develop. The Queen found herself nodding in agreement. Her own background had taught her the difference between owning land and truly understanding it. "What would you like to see happen?" she asked. "Recognition that family farms provide services beyond just food production," Helen replied. "We maintain landscapes, support wildlife, store carbon, provide rural employment, preserve traditional skills. If government wants to achieve environmental and social goals, they should be supporting family farms, not making them unviable." This conversation stayed with Camilla as she returned to her official duties later that week. During a visit to a Women's Institute meeting in Gloucestershire, she found herself discussing farming issues with members whose families had connections to agriculture going back generations. The Women's Institute had been founded partly to support rural communities during difficult times, and its members understood intuitively what policymakers sometimes missed: that rural Britain's strength came from its communities, not just its economic output. Mary Webster, who had been a member for 40 years, shared her family's story. "My husband's family farmed here for 6 generations. When he died 5 years ago, I had to sell half the land to pay inheritance tax. The remaining farm was too small to be viable, so I had to lease it to a large agricultural company. They do a good job, but it's not the same. They don't know which field floods first in heavy rain, which corner is always dry in drought, where the best soil is. That knowledge died with my husband, and now it's lost forever.
The Queen listened thoughtfully, recognizing that Mary's story illustrated a deeper truth about the inheritance tax issue.
It wasn't just about money, it was about the transfer of irreplaceable knowledge and the continuity of stewardship that made British agriculture resilient and sustainable. Meanwhile, King Charles was discovering that his Norfolk walks had taken on new significance for local residents. Farmers began timing their work to coincide with his regular routes, hoping for conversations that might somehow influence the national debate. The king welcomed these encounters, finding that they provided insights no briefing paper could match. One morning, he met Sarah and James Mitchell, a young couple who had recently taken over a mixed farm that had been in James's family for over a century. They had modernized the operation extensively, introducing rotational grazing systems that improved soil health, establishing hedgerows that provided wildlife corridors, and creating a farm education program for local schools.
"We're not asking for special treatment," Sarah explained as they walked between fields where cattle grazed among trees planted by James's great-grandfather. "We just want the same opportunity every previous generation has had to build on what came before and pass something better on to the next generation. These new tax rules make that almost impossible." Charles was particularly interested in their environmental initiatives. The hedgerows they had planted not only provided habitat for wildlife but also helped prevent soil erosion and improved water retention during drought periods. The rotational grazing system they had implemented actually increased the land's carbon storage capacity while improving its productivity. "This is exactly the kind of farming Britain needs more of," he told them. "You're proving that traditional family farming and environmental stewardship can work together. But you need security and continuity to make long-term investments like these." James nodded enthusiastically. "That's exactly it, Your Majesty. When you know your children will inherit the land, you plant trees and improve soil for decades to come. When you're not sure if the farm will stay in the family, you focus on short-term returns instead of long-term sustainability." This conversation reinforced Charles's growing conviction that the farming inheritance tax debate was really about much larger questions: how Britain wanted to manage its landscape, what kind of food system it wanted to maintain, and whether rural communities would have the stability and continuity necessary to provide environmental stewardship for future generations. The king began incorporating these insights into his regular meetings with government officials. While he couldn't advocate for specific policies, he could ensure that policymakers understood the complex interconnections between agricultural inheritance, environmental sustainability, food security, and rural community viability. During one particularly significant meeting at Clarence House, Charles brought together Treasury officials, environmental scientists, and representatives from farming organizations. The discussion that emerged surprised everyone with its complexity and sophistication. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, an agricultural economist from Cambridge University, presented research showing that family-owned farms consistently outperformed corporate agricultural operations in measures of environmental stewardship, soil health, and local economic impact. "There's something about long-term ownership that encourages sustainable practices," she explained. "When your children and grandchildren will work the same land, you invest in its long-term health." Treasury officials acknowledged the research but emphasized the government's need for revenue and the principle that all assets should be treated equally for tax purposes. However, the discussion helped them understand that agricultural land wasn't just another asset class, it was the foundation of food production, environmental management, and rural community stability. Queen Camilla complemented these policy discussions with continued public engagement. Her visit to a farmer's market in Bath revealed how family farms contributed to local food systems in ways that large agricultural corporations couldn't replicate. Small-scale producers offered variety, quality, and personal relationships that connected consumers directly to the land and the people who worked it. At the market, she met Jenny Phillips, who had converted her family's traditional dairy farm into a diversified operation producing artisan cheeses, free-range eggs, and seasonal vegetables. Jenny's products were more expensive than supermarket alternatives, but customers were willing to pay extra for quality, freshness, and the knowledge that their purchases supported local agriculture and environmental stewardship. "This is our way of making family farming viable,"
Jenny explained as she wrapped a selection of cheeses for a customer who had been buying from her for over 10 years. We couldn't compete with industrial agriculture on price, but we could compete on quality, sustainability, and local connection. The Queen watched Jenny interact with her customers, noting how these weren't just commercial transactions but relationships built over years of trust and shared values.
This was rural Britain at its best: economically viable, environmentally sustainable, and socially connected.
As February progressed, both the King and Queen found themselves increasingly convinced that the farming inheritance tax debate represented a critical moment for British agriculture and rural society. Their different approaches, his quiet diplomacy and her public advocacy, were creating a comprehensive picture of the challenges and opportunities facing family farms. The story was far from over, but already it was clear that this royal couple was redefining how the monarchy could contribute to national debates while respecting constitutional boundaries. They were proving that leadership could be both humble and effective, both traditional and innovative. The next phase would test whether their growing understanding and influence could help bridge the gap between agricultural communities and government policymakers, between rural traditions and modern economic realities, between immediate political pressures and long-term national interests. The breakthrough came on a grey Thursday morning in early March, during what appeared to be a routine meeting at the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Queen Camilla had been invited to discuss rural education initiatives, but the conversation quickly expanded to encompass the broader challenges facing British agriculture. Present at the meeting were Education Minister Sarah Chan, Environment Secretary David Richardson, Treasury Representative James Whittaker, and several officials from agricultural organizations. What started as a formal briefing evolved into something more significant: a genuine dialogue about the future of British farming and rural communities. The inheritance tax changes were designed with large estates and commercial properties in mind, Treasury Representative Whittaker acknowledged. But we're beginning to understand that family farms operate under completely different principles. The question is whether we can develop policies that distinguish between agricultural land that's actively farmed by families and agricultural land that's held primarily as an investment. Queen Camilla seized this opening. During my visits to farming communities, I've learned that successful family farms provide services that go far beyond food production. They maintain landscapes, preserve wildlife habitats, store carbon, provide rural employment, and serve as repositories of agricultural knowledge that takes generations to develop. Shouldn't government policy recognize these broader contributions? The Queen's point was supported by Dr. Margaret Foster, representing the National Farmers Union, who had brought detailed economic analysis to the meeting. Our research shows that family farms reinvest 93% of their income back into their operations and local communities, compared to 67% for corporate agricultural operations. When family farms are broken up and sold, rural communities lose not just employers but also the civic leadership, local spending, and community investment that keeps villages viable. Education Minister Chen raised another important point. We're also seeing declining enrollment in agricultural education programs. Young people are choosing other careers partly because they perceive farming as economically unstable. If we want Britain to maintain food security and environmental stewardship, we need to make farming attractive to the next generation. Meanwhile, in Norfolk, King Charles was experiencing his own moment of clarity. During his morning walk through the Sandringham estate, he encountered a group of agricultural students from nearby Easton and Otley College who were studying sustainable farming techniques on the Royal Estate's demonstration plots. The students were led by Professor Michael Thompson, who had been working with the estate for over a decade to develop farming methods that balanced productivity with environmental protection. Your Majesty, Professor Thompson explained, these young people represent the future of British agriculture. They understand climate change, biodiversity conservation, soil health, and precision farming technologies better than any previous generation. But they need stable family farms to practice these skills. One student, Rebecca Walsh from a farming family in Lincolnshire, shared her concerns with the King. My family's farm has been organic for 20 years, she said. We've invested heavily in soil improvement, wildlife habitats, and renewable energy. But my younger brother is studying computer science instead of agriculture because he doesn't think farming offers a secure future. That breaks my father's heart. Charles found himself moved by Rebecca's story, which echoed conversations he'd had with farming families throughout Norfolk.
"What would convince your brother to reconsider farming?" he asked.
"Certainty," Rebecca replied without hesitation. "Certainty that he could inherit the farm without selling half of it to pay taxes. Certainty that government policies would support family farms rather than favor large corporations. Certainty that farming is valued as a profession, not just tolerated as a quaint rural activity." This conversation reinforced the king's growing conviction that the farming inheritance issue was really about Britain's long-term food security, environmental sustainability, and rural community viability. He decided to convene an informal gathering at Sandringham that would bring together all the stakeholders he'd been meeting individually. The Sandringham Summit, as it came to be known, took place on a bright March morning in the estate's conference facilities. Unlike formal government meetings, this gathering was designed to encourage open dialogue between people who rarely had opportunities to speak directly with each other. Present were young farmers like Tom Harrison and Rebecca Walsh, established farming families like the Mitchells and Weatherbys, agricultural scientists, rural business owners, and representatives from government departments. The king served as facilitator rather than advocate, asking questions and ensuring that every voice was heard. The first session focused on understanding the current challenges. Emma Hartwell, who had inherited her family's vegetable farm in Kent, painted a stark picture. "Our farm employs 12 local people and supplies vegetables to restaurants throughout southeast England. We've invested in renewable energy, reduced pesticide use by 80% through integrated pest management, and increased our soil organic matter every year for the past decade. But, under current inheritance tax proposals, my daughter would have to sell 60% of the land to pay taxes when I retire." A farm that size couldn't support the same employment or maintain the same environmental programs. Treasury observer Patricia Wells acknowledged the dilemma. "Government needs revenue, and there's political pressure to ensure that all assets are taxed fairly. But these discussions are helping us understand that agricultural assets are fundamentally different from financial investments. Land generates income of maybe 2 or 3% annually, but inheritance tax assumes it's similar to assets that might generate 10 or 15% returns." Professor Thompson introduced research from the estate's demonstration plots that surprised everyone. "We've been measuring carbon storage in different farming systems for 5 years, he explained. Well-managed family farms consistently store more carbon per hectare than corporate agricultural operations. The difference appears to be related to long-term thinking. Family farmers invest in soil health and tree planting because they expect their children to benefit from these improvements." This environmental angle captured the attention of Environment Secretary Richardson's representative, Janet Morrison. "If family farms provide superior environmental services, shouldn't government policy encourage their continuation rather than making them economically unviable?" The second session focused on potential solutions. Young farmer David Chen, whose family's market garden had become a model of sustainable immigrant entrepreneurship, proposed a novel approach. What if inheritance tax relief for agricultural land was tied to environmental and community performance? Farms that meet certain standards for employment, environmental stewardship, local food supply, and educational access could qualify for reduced tax rates. This suggestion sparked intense discussion. Sarah Mitchell, who had been developing educational programs on her family's farm, expanded the idea. "We already measure farms for environmental compliance, food safety, and animal welfare. Why not measure them for community contribution and long-term sustainability?" Farms that score well on comprehensive assessments could qualify for inheritance tax relief, while those that don't would pay standard rates. Queen Camilla, who had arrived for the afternoon session, was intrigued by this approach. So inheritance tax relief would become an incentive for sustainable farming practices rather than an automatic entitlement, she asked. "Exactly," replied Rebecca Walsh. "It would reward farmers who provide environmental services, employ local people, supply local food systems, and invest in long-term sustainability. It would encourage the kind of farming Britain needs while ensuring that tax relief goes to deserving operations." The king found this performance-based approach appealing because it addressed government revenue concerns while supporting the kind of farming that provided broader social and environmental benefits. "How would you measure these contributions?" he asked. Professor Thompson outlined a framework that was already being piloted on several farms. We measure carbon storage, biodiversity indices, soil health, water quality protection, local employment, local food supply, educational access, and community investment. Farms that score in the top tier on multiple measures would qualify for maximum inheritance tax relief. Those with lower scores would receive proportionally less relief. The afternoon session revealed growing consensus around this performance-based approach. Even Treasury Representative Whitaker acknowledged its potential. This could actually increase government revenue in the long term by encouraging more productive and sustainable farming while ensuring that tax relief rewards genuine agricultural operations rather than land speculation. The Sandringham Summit concluded with agreement to develop detailed proposals for performance-based agricultural inheritance tax relief. A working group would include representatives from farming organizations, environmental scientists, Treasury officials, and rural development experts. Over the following weeks, both King Charles and Queen Camilla continued their advocacy through different channels. The King hosted additional meetings with government officials, ensuring that the Sandringham discussions reached appropriate policymakers. The Queen expanded her public engagement, visiting agricultural colleges and farming communities to build broader support for the emerging proposals. The momentum created by their efforts began producing tangible results. In April, the Chancellor announced that agricultural inheritance tax changes would be delayed pending comprehensive review of their impact on family farms and rural communities. This wasn't the complete victory farming organizations had hoped for, but it provided breathing room for developing more sophisticated policies. More significantly, the Treasury agreed to pilot the performance-based inheritance tax relief system with voluntary participants from across Britain. 50 family farms representing different agricultural sectors and geographic regions would participate in the 2-year trial, with their performance measured according to the framework developed at Sandringham. The pilot program attracted immediate interest from farming families who saw it as an opportunity to demonstrate their value beyond simple food production. Applications exceeded available slots by more than 3-to-1, with farms proposing innovative approaches to environmental stewardship, community engagement, and sustainable agriculture. Tom Harrison, the young Norfolk farmer who had first explained his concerns to King Charles during the tractor convoy, was selected for the pilot program. His farm's application included plans to increase carbon storage through expanded hedgerows, provide educational experiences for urban schoolchildren, generate renewable energy through solar panels, and employ additional local young people in value-added enterprises. This gives us hope, Tom explained to local media. Instead of being taxed for owning land, we'll be rewarded for using it responsibly. It encourages long-term thinking and investment in sustainability. The pilot program's launch event at the Royal Agricultural University drew participants from across Britain. Queen Camilla's address to the gathered farmers emphasized the broader significance of their participation. "You're not just testing a tax policy," she told them. "You're demonstrating that family farming can be economically viable, environmentally sustainable, and socially beneficial. You're proving that agriculture is about much more than producing commodities." King Charles's closing remarks at the event reflected his months of learning through Norfolk conversations. "Agriculture is the foundation of civilization," he said. "But modern agriculture must be more than just food production. It must be stewardship of landscape, protection of biodiversity, storage of carbon, preservation of knowledge, and foundation of rural communities." The families participating in this pilot program are showing how farming can serve all these purposes while remaining economically viable. As summer arrived, early results from the pilot program exceeded expectations. Participating farms were not only meeting performance targets but discovering that sustainable practices often improved their profitability. Carbon storage initiatives qualified for environmental payments, direct sales to local consumers commanded premium prices, and agritourism enterprises provided additional income streams. The success stories began attracting attention from farming communities throughout Britain and Europe. Agricultural ministers from several European Union countries requested briefings on the British approach, seeing potential applications for their own agricultural policies. More importantly for British farming families, the pilot program was changing the national conversation about agriculture. Instead of debates about tax avoidance and rural privilege, discussions focused on the services farmers provided and how policies could encourage sustainable agriculture. By autumn, public opinion polling showed strong support for performance-based agricultural policies. Urban consumers, initially skeptical of special treatment for farmers, became supportive when they understood the connection between sustainable farming practices and environmental protection, food security, and rural community viability. The King and Queen's patient advocacy had succeeded in ways that dramatic gestures or political confrontation never could have achieved. By listening carefully, building understanding gradually, and bringing different stakeholders together for genuine dialogue, they had helped transform a divisive political issue into a collaborative search for solutions. As King Charles continued his morning walks through Norfolk and Queen Camilla maintained her visits to farming communities, they reflected on what they had accomplished together. They had proven that constitutional monarchy could provide leadership on complex national issues while respecting democratic processes and institutional boundaries. More significantly, they had demonstrated that effective leadership in modern Britain required not just authority but authenticity, not just position but genuine understanding, not just power but the patience to build consensus through careful listening and thoughtful dialogue. The story of their support for family farming had become a model for how the monarchy could serve Britain in the 21st century, not as distant symbols of tradition, but as engaged citizens working to understand and address the real challenges facing their communities. The bells of St. Mary Magdalene continued to ring over Norfolk each Sunday, calling King Charles to worship and reflection. But now they also seemed to call him to service in a broader sense, service to the land, to the people who worked it, and to the future generations who would inherit both its challenges and its possibilities. The quiet revolution that had begun with morning prayers and farming conversations was reshaping not just agricultural policy, but the role of monarchy in modern democratic society. It was a revolution built not on protest or confrontation, but on patience, understanding, and the conviction that genuine leadership meant listening more than speaking, learning more than teaching, and serving more than ruling.